Welcome to Unit 5, where we are looking at the whole concept of international trade. And this is a unit that is easy to comprehend because we live in a world or an environment where international trade takes place. So let us begin our discussion by defining what we mean by international trade. So international trade is simply the exchange of goods and services between countries. So it's the exchange of goods and services between countries. All right, great. So that is international trade. And the next question might become why trade? And we trade for several reasons. One, we want to provide goods and services to the domestic market that we cannot produce. And it is that we cannot produce or that we choose not to produce. For example, American apples. It might be that our climate does not support American apples, but we want to provide those sort of goods to our domestic market so that they have options, they have choices. All right. So that's one of the reasons why we trade, to provide those goods and services to the domestic market that we cannot produce or that we choose not to produce. We also trade because we might lack resources. So, in other words, we lack the resources to produce. So, currently in Jamaica, we don't produce vehicles. And so, in order to be able to offer vehicles to our domestic population, then we facilitate trading with other countries. We also might just want access to larger markets. In other words, we know that we are efficient at producing a particular good or service. And so we trade by offering these goods or service to the wider world so that we can get access to their markets so that foreigners can produce our goods and services. So these are three of the primary reasons why we end up trading. Well, maybe I should just add one more. We also trade so that we can offer lower prices to the domestic market. For example, if a country like, let's say, India produces something at far lower prices than we are able to produce it for within our economy, then it makes sense for us to import those stuff from from India so that we can offer these goods and services to our population. All right. So I think it's now time for us to talk about the concept of absolute and comparative advantage. So what's absolute advantage? Well, absolute advantage is going to be the the situation whereby So the situation whereby a country is able to produce more. So a country is able to produce more with the same quality and quantity of resources. So with the same quantity and quality of resources. And this is really speaking about efficiency and productivity. So the country is able to do more with less. And this tells us that we have an absolute advantage. For example, if we look at our scenario that is displayed inside our table, we're saying that within a particular day, Jamaica makes 100 or can produce 100 tons of banana, as opposed to Belize that can only create 60 tons of banana within that day. So it therefore tells us that Jamaica has a competitive advantage over Belize in terms of banana production. And remember, this is just a typical example. We are not saying that this is the actual case in reality. When we look at oranges, we can also say that Jamaica has an absolute advantage over Belize because Jamaica is producing 50 tons a day or can produce 50 tons a day, whereas Belize can only produce 20 tons a day. So in terms of that logic, once again, we are seeing that Jamaica also has an absolute advantage in terms of orange production. So Jamaica is able to do more with the same quantity and quality of resources in terms of producing bananas and in terms of producing oranges. Which now leads us to the concept of comparative advantage. So we want to have a look at comparative advantage. And in comparative advantage, we're saying that a country has a competitive advantage has a competitive advantage when it can produce. So when it can produce the same quantity, and I'll just use goods here, the same quantity of goods as another country, but at a lower opportunity cost. Now, the concept of opportunity cost is something that we have spoken about before. Opportunity cost is what do you have to give up? So what do you have to give up or sacrifice in order to pursue the opportunity? So what do you give up or sacrifice in order to pursue a given opportunity? So if a country can produce the same quantity of goods or services as another country, but at a lower opportunity cost, then we are saying that that country has a competitive advantage over the other. And we are going to use our same scenario here to facilitate comparisons. All right. The concept of a ratio becomes important I would have started out our discussions in general by indicating the importance of maths as you go through this module. So the concept of a ratio becomes important. And a ratio is usually expressed as some variable with a colon followed by another variable. And what this really means is how much of A, so assume that A is an item, how much of A equates to 1 unit of B. So how many units of A equates to 1 unit of B? And that essentially is what a ratio is trying to capture. The order in which we place it is important. So let us bear that in mind as we go through the example. So we are looking at Jamaica. And we are looking at banana production. With respect to orange production. So 100 bananas to 50 oranges. We can write this as being 100 over 50, where 100 in this case is going to be the numerator. And when we do the simplifications, then we will end up with 2 over 1. 50 goes into 100 2 times. So this tells us that the simplified ratio is going to be 2 to 1. And if we interpret this, then what we are saying is that it takes 2 bananas to create 1 orange. Or in other words, in order to create 1 orange, we have to give up creating 2 bananas. Let us now compare the case with Belize. So let's say Belize and banana production with respect to oranges. So we had 60 to 20, which says that the 60 goes on top, the 20 goes below, and this equates to 3 over 1. So in terms of the simplified ratio, it's 3 to 1. And it tells us that it takes 3 bananas to create 1 orange. And if we just look at it and we compare, from Jamaica's perspective, it takes 2 bananas to create 1 orange. But in terms of Belize, it creates 3 bananas to create 1 orange. So therefore, who is giving up less? And if we ask who is giving up less in this context, it should be clear that Jamaica is giving up less, because it's costing Jamaica 2 units of bananas to make 1 orange, whereas it's costing Belize 3. So in this case, we know that Jamaica has comparative advantage in producing oranges over Belize. Let's now reverse the equation. Let us look at Jamaica, but this time we're looking at it from the perspective of orange to bananas. So this tells us that orange is 50, banana is 100. So remember, it now means that 50 is going to be at the top, 100 below, which tells us that when simplified, we get a half, which tells us that the ratio of orange to banana is now 1 to 2. And if we do the same computations for Belize, so let's go get Belize. And now remember, Belize is going to be looking at oranges with respect to bananas. And then that's going to be 20 to 60, which means that we have 20 at the top, 60 below. That is equal to 1 over 3. So in short, it is saying that 1 to 3. And if we now look at it from this perspective, and we want to determine, well, what is happening in this scenario, then bear in mind that a half is equal to 0.5, and bear in mind that a third is equal to 0.33. So therefore, if we think in terms of the fractional units, we should see that a third is less than a half. So therefore, it tells us that in this case, Belize has the competitive advantage. So therefore, Belize should be creating or producing bananas. But let's simplify matters, and instead of dealing instead of dealing with the fractional components, let's convert everything to whole numbers so that we can see what is happening. So in order to get rid of the decimal, we can multiply by 100. And if we multiply by 100 on one side of our equation, it means we need to multiply by 100 on the other side of the equation. So this, in a sense, was saying that half of an orange to one banana, whereas this one is saying 0.33 of an orange to one banana. Now, it's not so easy to work in terms of the decimals. So we converted it to whole numbers. So 100 times 0.5. And this is going to end up giving us 50. And this is going to end up giving us 30. But let me use different colors. So this gives us 50. 50 what? 50 tons, because tons was the unit. And this gives us what? It gives us 30 tons, because tons was the unit. Now we have to multiply the one banana by 100 so that we can keep the equation the same in both cases. So it therefore tells us that 50 tons to create 100 bananas. And it tells us that 30 tons to create 100 bananas. So 30 tons of oranges as opposed to 50 tons of oranges. And the question that we were asking is, who is sacrificing less? Who is giving up less? And in this case, giving up 30 tons to produce an equivalent 100 tons of bananas is much less than giving up 50. Therefore, and remember, it's for the same 100 bananas. So therefore, we can conclude that Belize has the competitive advantage when producing bananas, because they are giving up less of the same unit, which is oranges, to create bananas, or to create 100 bananas, as opposed to Jamaica, who is giving up 50 tons of the same resource, the same unit, which is orange, to create a similar 100 bananas. So it's instructive for us to bear in mind that countries trade because they want to provide goods and services that they can't produce or choose not to produce. They trade because they might lack access to larger markets and they want that access, or they want to lower the prices on the domestic market, etc. And we are saying that the concepts of absolute advantage and comparative advantage is important in determining from a strategic standpoint what is the focus going to be in terms of production. And we will stop here for session 1. And then in session 2, we will then come back and have a discussion about barriers to international trade. And then we will wrap up by talking about the balance of payment accounts, etc. So thank you and stay tuned.